afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to see so many people show up for the seminar. I was invited by Mira Shah to conduct a seminar on writing a scientific manuscript and getting it published. My name is Jennifer Cullen. I'm a consultant for Science Docs, but I'm also a full-time employee of the Department of Defense. But none of the work I'm sharing here today is affiliated with that. I have to say that as a disclaimer. I want to spend just a couple of minutes introducing myself, but I thought it would be helpful for you to understand the structure of the talk I'll be giving today so you can pace yourself and decide on note-taking and whatnot. The first few minutes I'll just spend breaking down my primary and secondary goals of the seminar today for you. And then I want to spend a little over half an hour on the components of a manuscript. What are the core features that must be in any manuscript, no matter what scientific discipline you are in? And then I'm going to move to roughly a half an hour discussion of the peer review process. Because as many of you know, if you've already gone through the submission of a manuscript, it is quite a process, and it's very important to be mindful of all of the critical steps that you must take to be successful in that process. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time on a section that I wanted to call salesmanship and strategy, because over the years that I've been in the field of cancer research, I have learned that it is not just about being a good scientist, it's not just about having good data, it's also how you weave your story. And there is a salesmanship to that. And whether you want to feel that in the sciences we need to be salespeople, if you can't master that skill, you're not going to get into the top journals. And it really is that simple. And I have learned that the hard way. If you want to get into JAMA and New England Journal and JCO and all of these very high-end journals, you have to be a good storyteller. So I'm going to offer up some tips and strategies that I hope will improve your skills at that. We're going to take a brief break because I don't want to just talk at you all afternoon. And when we return from that break, we're going to spend probably the most time we will today on a didactic session. And I'm going to try to make it interactive, but there really are a critical need for you to understand study methodology, which includes epidemiologic principles and statistics. And before anyone rolls their eyes or glosses over on the use of the word statistics, you really cannot read the peer review literature if you don't understand some basic things about modeling, data modeling, methodology, study design, and stats. It's really critically important for you to master just the fundamentals. It's not even that extensive, but it's critically important for you to dissect your own work and the work of others in the peer review literature. Then we're going to go over a very brief discussion of common pitfalls, things that I see my own team. I mentor a team of postdocs and medical residents and staff who collect data for a database I oversee of 30,000 men. And the staff that I oversee also submit peer review manuscripts. They support me with some of my work, but they also submit their own work. And there's a lot of common mistakes I see people make that I wanted to share and point out with you today. And then finally, we're going to end with a critique of a paper in the back of the room that I might ask Mira to hand out, but not now. As we go on, there's going to be 2 interactive sessions today. I'm going to close out the salesmanship and strategy session with an interactive discussion of a paper. The paper that we'll critique at the end of the day will allow you to apply some of the skills that I'll be discussing over the course of this entire seminar. And then we'll break into groups, and given the size of this room, I'm probably going to have about 5 groups of 5, and we'll discuss a paper. I'll give you about 10 minutes to read it, about another 5 to 10 minutes to discuss it as a group, and then we'll go through some critical elements that I've spelled out for you on the slides to come. So introductory remarks. So I did my training at UC Berkeley. I have my bachelor's in integrative biology, as well as my PhD in cancer epidemiology from back in the 90s. That dates me, but it's okay. I'm all right with my age. I also spent a few years at Georgetown University as junior faculty in their Lombardi Cancer Comprehensive Center. And I've spent the last 10 years with the DoD in a program that collects data on military patients diagnosed with prostate cancer. We have about 30,000 of these men that we follow from the time of diagnosis until they've died. And along the continuum of their follow-up, we collect information on their biospecimens, genetic data, as well as quality of life information, and hopefully better prognosticate what causes men to die of prostate cancer. So most of my background is in cancer epi, but today's seminar, I've tried to make it broad enough in scope that a mental health postdoc would also benefit, and I've tried to draw from examples in the literature. The 2 examples, the interactive sessions today will both be papers in the field of mental health, since I was told that would be the audience here today. And on that note, I want to just quickly ask, how many of you here today are in some discipline of mental health? Just so I have an understanding of my audience. Okay, so maybe it's not everybody then. So my paper choices might not be completely germane, but the methods will be, and the skills that we need to take to each of those papers will be. So how many of you are here from the Cancer Institute, National Cancer Institute? Okay, a couple people, actually quite a few. And what other, can I call on someone who hasn't raised their hand, what other institutes are represented here today? Who didn't raise their hand? I couldn't hear you. Okay, anyone else? Urology? No, the other head. Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay, thank you. So with that in mind, that's helpful to me as the speaker. I want to know who my audience is. I'm going to probably use examples beyond just mental health, because only a few of you seem like you're here from NIMH. So today's primary goals are really to focus on two critical tasks. One is to help enhance your understanding of the core elements of a scientific manuscript. What must those things be? And the second is to clarify the submission process. I often feel like people come to me thinking it's a black box, and it's really not. It's very straightforward, and there are core steps and core things you need to do to be successful in that process. And just so you know, I have over 100 peer-reviewed papers, so you know that I have gone through this process. I know what it's like. I know the pains of it. I know what rejection feels like. I know what success feels like. And I think that I have learned a lot in my 20 plus years since getting my doctoral degree, what it takes to be successful. So I hope I can impart some of those nuggets of wisdom on each of you today. And then the secondary goals of today's seminar will be to improve the quality of your writing, because ultimately this seminar is for you, but you need to take back these skills and apply it to manuscripts that you have in process that you're writing. And as you think about even planning, as you collect data, as you're thinking about the methods of your study design, I want those ideas to be top of mind, because it really isn't just the paper that you're writing that matters. It's several steps upstream of that matter when you're actually collecting the data and you're thinking about your research question and you're designing a specific aim, that it be crisp and clear and articulated well from the very beginning. And that's actually probably one of the most common pitfalls I see, is people, if I were to put somebody on the spot with a paper that's in draft mode and say, what's your specific aim? They look like a deer in headlights. They can't answer that. If you can't put your own work into one sentence quickly, on the spot, no thinking, no time, then you don't know it. And your idea isn't crisp even for you. And disaster will only come from that. So I'm going to focus on the idea of articulating clear research questions. Another important goal, secondary goal, will be to improve your acceptance rates, because if your paper's high quality and you're selling it well and your data are sound and your methods are good, then it will be accepted somewhere. It may not get into Nature, Science, Cell, but it will get in somewhere, and hopefully a journal that's relevant and germane to the field of study that you're in. And then finally, a selfish goal I would have would be, we all want to see better literature. It's frustrating for me as an epidemiologist to pick up a peer-reviewed paper and to see a really bad epi paper, epi study, or even worse when it's on the media and somebody's quoting a dietary finding that's highly inconsistent with a previous finding, and we're just confusing the public. And then it just discredits the whole field. And I've even had friends, my friends from my undergrad years took a variety of paths. Some are physicists, some are physicians, and when they discredit the field, or they'll say, oh, your field never seems to be consistent, it's upsetting, because it casts a shadow of doubt on the credibility of my field as a scientific discipline. Because what's more scientific than reproducibility and repeatability? If you don't have those things, what do you have? So it's critically important that we do have consistent findings, and when we don't, we explain it very well. Why didn't you have the same finding as another author? Are your data that much better? What's different? So those are some of the themes and elements we'll be talking about today. And then finally, I said already, benefiting the public, but the research community that you're in. We're all colleagues, and I look at my colleagues when I have a paper that does differ in findings. One of the first things I do is I go to the first author of the paper, or the senior author, the last author, and I'll let him or her know, hi, we're about to submit a paper, and I just wanted to give you an FYI. Our data are fundamentally different than yours. Would you mind taking a look at the paper? and give me your thoughts, and perhaps I'll acknowledge you, or we'll even add you as a co-author if it's appropriate, if they contribute something significant, because I want them to be aware, rather than blindsiding somebody and saying, aha, we're different and we're better. I want my colleagues to know. And I think that comes with being in your field for a long time. Maybe that's something someone younger won't feel comfortable doing, but perhaps if you are younger and you're just starting out and you're new at writing papers and submitting papers, go to your senior author and propose that and say, I think that this should be shared with, John Smith, who's published on this topic, whose data are very different, and let him weigh in and let him say, I think this could be a reason. Your paper will be so much stronger as a result. I think too often we're so worried about getting that first credit or getting scooped by somebody who has a similar idea but gets their work published first, that we've lost the sense of community in the research field. And I really am desperate in my own team to get that back. That it is really the first thing I do when my data are different. So those are the goals of today. It's a little bit about me. Does anyone have any questions about the structure of today, or who I am, or what topics we're covering before we get started? Yes, in the back. I'm happy to, absolutely. So if you don't want to take notes, you want to sit back, relax, kick up your feet, that's fine. You don't need to take notes. I'll give them to Mira, and Mira, you have a registration list of everyone?
Everyone registered through that Eventbrite.
Okay, and if you didn't, perhaps during the break they can share their name and email with you. Okay, great. All right, so the first module, as I mentioned, will be the core components of manuscript development. I put this diagram up not to read it to you. That would be terribly boring, but to give you a sense of the continuum. This is almost like a cladogram in that the branches next to each other are the ones that are most closely related. And as you go from left to right, you want to make sure that you've thought about all of these things. And so the most upstream event on this slide, not surprisingly, is to come up with an idea. And for many of you, by the looks of your faces and what I think might be your age group, I think that probably many of you are working with a supervisor and a mentor who's a more senior scientist, established scientist. And so for many of you, you're going to be getting that idea and tinkering with that idea with a mentor. And if that's the case, then this may not be your own idea, but that doesn't mean you can't bring some teeth to it and say, I've read the literature. I'll tell you right now, as a more senior scientist, I very infrequently get the luxury of spending half a day on PubMed and just reading. And I miss that. But I have to count on my team to do it for me because I'm too busy. I have grants, I have obligations of supervision and travel and talks to give. So in that context, I count on people to read on PubMed, to, if I say the topic of interest to me is cancer epi and survival, I need to know they do a thorough, careful job of that lit search. So for you, as a supportive role, that's something you need to do. Spend your time on PubMed. Think out of the box. Go to other resources. I mean, in the age of Google, my gosh, I didn't grow up with Google. You can put anything into Google and it will give you an answer, and it's just phenomenal. Blows my brain. After you have the research idea, you need to clarify it. You need to be, what I mentioned before, as crystal clear and sharp in what that idea is. No matter who stopped you on the street, no matter what field of research they're in, or if they're not a researcher, even better, the harder audience to sell this on would be a layperson, to try to explain to a layperson, maybe your spouse, your significant other, a friend, your parent, what is your research idea? If you can't distill it down in about 10 to 15 words or less, then you don't have a clear sense of that yet, and you need to improve your understanding of your own question. And then downstream of this would be the outline, working with a team. All of these elements may not be germane to each of you, depending on the paper, depending on the research question, but at one point or another, all of these elements will play into at least one paper that you write. And then you want to come up with a research method. They call it a plan. If your methods aren't clear, then nothing else matters. And actually, one of the tips I give to the doctors I work with, because the doctors don't get this training, the MDs I work with very often aren't trained. There's no time for this kind of a discussion or this kind of a part of their education. It just isn't there. And I have many friends that are MDs, and they've all shared this with me. So I hope I'm speaking accurately. I'm getting a nod. Thank you. Yeah. And it's too bad. And you know what? A lot of them will come to me and say, well, I typically read the abstract and the table's figures. And I just hang my head in sadness because I think I understand the urgency sometimes of reading quickly. You don't have time. But let me ask you this. If you got to the discussion section and you read just the final conclusion that an author had, and it was the most compelling finding and it's stated well, and you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, this is earth-shattering science, this is going to change the field, and you think that you're hanging your hat on a really excellent paper, but in the meantime, the methods are based on shoddy methodology, poor statistical modeling, a data set that's biased, a cohort that's not followed accurately, measurements that are imprecise. Should you be placing any weight on that conclusion? Absolutely not. So I think without reading the methods, you've missed the meat and potatoes of the paper. The methods to me are where I go first. I don't even want to read the abstract. I don't want to hear what you have to say about anything until I understand what data did you use and how did you measure your outcomes, your predictors, how did you follow patients, and how did you statistically analyze your data? Because if none of those elements is in place, I'm already coming to the results with some doubt. And another thing I didn't mention, and it's something I would encourage all of you to do, is about 5 years ago, I joined the board of a peer-reviewed journal, and I help with the review process. So I get about a paper a month to review, and I get to weigh in and say what's good, what's bad, what needs to be modified so that the authors can revise and resubmit their work, and we'll talk about that in a while. And I also was asked to sit on a different board for a very different journal and help vet the papers that get accepted to make sure that the reviewers did their job. And it's actually an amazing process to go through because there's the review itself that we should all be doing. We should all volunteer, and if you have mentors or supervisors that get invited to review papers, ask them if they'll let you do one. And then maybe if they don't have time to sit down and review it with you, at least it's an experience for you to understand how to pick apart someone else's work. Because I think we're all critics of ourselves, but to understand how to critique the literature makes you a better writer. It gets on your mind and on your radar the things you're not doing well. And I think it's always easier to be hard on someone else. In fact, one of the earliest lessons I learned as a peer reviewer is how awful some people are to each other. They'll bring up the most ridiculous comments and harp on them as though the paper is just trash because one small thing wasn't addressed. And I noticed a pattern once I became a board member that it's always the younger reviewers that do it to each other. It's always the younger writers that are so mean and so nasty. So we'll get to this later, but I will encourage you not to be sensitive because I can tell you right now it's the least experienced people typically that are the harshest. So you're really getting your worst criticism from those next to you, your peers. But don't be mad at each other. All right, so the next big step in this process is IRB approvals. I'm sure we've all heard this dirty acronym. Most people cringe at the idea of having to deal with IRBs. You can't do anything without IRB approval. It's critically important that you involve the institutions that you work for, that they can vet your work, they can read it, they can make sure it's consistent with the messaging of the institution, that it doesn't put anything out there that would make the institution look bad. Here at NIH, I know that matters. We work with, and I'm on papers with other scientists in the NCI, and I can tell you all the time they have to go through a public affairs clearance office. So you really shouldn't be submitting any work until it's been seen by an institutional review board and the work is IRB approved itself. These are all things that would be done probably by a more senior person on your team, but make sure. And often I've even seen a criticism by a reviewer if you don't mention in the methods that the work was IRB reviewed and approved. Sometimes that's a criticism, and it takes maybe half a sentence to say that. And we'll get to that later. So I'm not going to go through any more of this diagram, but you can see there's a lot of steps. It's a long process. Anybody that hopes to be able to start a project, a brand new project with a brand new idea, and have a manuscript approved in under a year is kidding themselves. And I really mean that. You're kidding yourselves. The residents I work with only train with me for 6 months at a time, and then the next one comes in. And I say to them from the very day I sit down with them, this will not be in the peer review by the time you leave here. It would be lovely if we could submit it, and have it all done. But chances are what will happen after you leave is I will get back the revise and resubmit, and I'll have to take care of it, and I'll be the one to re-upload the paper. It just isn't a fast process. And we'll talk about selecting journals strategically so that we understand expectations and how to set our own expectations. All right, so the overview of the core components. I can't say this enough. Every section has a job to do. Don't be lazy with any section. From A to Z, intro to limitations to conclusions, every section is critically important and has a job, and you must accomplish that job within that section. I also want to focus a little bit in this module on creating effective titles, but as I mentioned, the salesmanship and strategy session, module 3, we'll get into that more, but we know that matters. It's the very first thing the author or the reviewer sees is your title. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about adequately citing work and using a reference database, which I hope all of you are already doing, and if you're not, I'll give you recommendations for what to use. And then assigning authorship. Probably one of the most overlooked aspects of writing a paper that causes hard feelings all the time. And I'll talk a little bit about why and how to do this well. And even if you have a boss that's the senior author on the paper, I can't tell you how many times people are too busy to educate their mentees and their supervisees on doing this properly, and it will create hard feelings. So we want to be very careful about assigning authorship. And then I mentioned the obtaining IRB approvals. So first, your title page. The title page has to have several core things on it. It shouldn't just be the title. I think that's probably obvious. You want to have every author listed, and you want to have their full names, even middle initials typically, unless the journal doesn't ask for that. And then you also want to list your funding source. You want to list any disclaimers or disclosures, which working at the DoD, we have a standard one that's revised every few years. It's my job to be mindful and aware of that revision and getting it right every time I submit a new paper. So I have somebody I work with constantly. When I get a peer review clearance to send in a paper, I'll always ask, can you just review my disclosure to make sure none of the language has changed? That's your job as the first author. And so now that I've mentioned the word first author, I want to ask for a raise of hands. How many people in the room have a first author publication already? Okay, so about half of you. And how many of you are currently working on a paper that's not yet published, but for which you will be the first author? Okay, so a little more than half of you. So that's great. So this is going to be very important advice for you to be thinking about right now. So you want to also make sure you include information on the corresponding author. That may not be you. You may be the first author, but whenever my residents are the first authors, I would never in a million years list them as the corresponding author because they don't check their emails, they're in clinic late at night. God help us if we get an R&R back and they don't see it for weeks and weeks, and then we lose an opportunity to revise the work. So you have to pick somebody that's reliable, somebody that's staying at the institution you're at, somebody that has the time, which also might not be your senior author, but think carefully about who is the best corresponding author. I would also defer to your mentors. Typically, they'll have a sense of who that ought to be, and maybe it is you. And then finally, there's always a limit on tables and figures. And in a moment, we'll get to reviewing the journal guidelines. But before you go crazy creating 50 tables and figures, understand that there is going to be a limit and choose wisely. So on the title page, that information needs to be clarified so that the reviewer of your paper knows what you did and has all these important nuggets of information up front. The next big piece is the abstract. I tell everyone I work with, please write this last. It's not the thing to start with. You're going to obsess over coming up with a shortened version of the longer story, but what you really need to do is tell your longer story first. You don't have to listen to me on this piece, but I would just strongly recommend, from years and years of experience, that this is the hardest thing to write because you don't get much space. Most journals will only allow for 250 to 300 words, and it has to have all the sections of the paper, the intro, the methods, the results, the conclusions. So if you only have 250 words, you want the best message possible. I have even heard that some journals now are using the abstracts to decide whether or not to send a paper out for peer review. And what that means is that if they don't choose you, your paper won't even get reviewed. It won't even be seen by an external reviewer. And right now, journals are getting so inundated with submissions that if you can't even get out for peer review, what a shame. You've missed an opportunity for somebody to see your work, like it, offer revisions, and get you accepted. So try to be very strategic in what you say in your abstract, but write it last. So then your introduction. Every introduction has a couple of critical goals. The first goal of the introduction is to build up the intensity and suspense of why does your aim matter? And you need to be able to point out in that build up what the gaps in the literature are, how the work that you're doing is going to fill a gap, at least one, And then finally, the last paragraph of any intro has to be your aim. My primary goal was, my study aim was, and it needs to be clear. It needs to be, again, it's that question of coming up with 10 to 15 words that you could tell your mom, your dad, your barber, your hairdresser, whoever, and they would understand what is it that you're working on. So that's a very critical and primary goal of the introduction section. The secondary goal is tied to the first goal. The gaps in the literature are very important. Your work isn't needed if this question is already clarified. And if you haven't specified why it's not, right away as I'm reading, I'm going to be thinking, this is another Me Too paper. This is boring, I'm falling asleep, you're not interesting. I need to know what's different. I need to know what you're doing that hasn't already been done. And it has to be done cleverly. You need to be able to not say it in such a way that others failed or other work is bad, but that you've added something new to a great question. Because if you just pick at or criticize the work that's already been done, you're now casting a shadow of doubt on the importance of the question. So what you want to do is celebrate the idea that other smart people have thought of this question and that you're another smart person thinking of it, but you bring something new to the table. And if you're not addressing a question that's ever been addressed before, feel free to use the word novel, but be careful. This is where you absolutely should not use that word unless you're 100% certain that you are novel. People love to throw that word out because they think if they've done the subtlest little twist on something, suddenly it's novel. That's not what novel means. Novel means first, so be careful. I see that word overused a lot these days, especially with whole genome sequencing in my field, because everybody thinks if there's one new SNP, oh my gosh, it's novel. Don't do that. All right. The methods. This is my favorite part. I have a lot of bullets here, and I'm just going to touch lightly on each of them. I do believe that the methodology section should be structured this way, but I do cancer research. If you're in a lab and you're doing lab bench science, this will be a little different. So you need to know what are the core sections of the journal that you're planning to submit your paper to. This is comprehensive, and this is how I structure every paper I write. The very first part of my methods is the source of my subjects. How did I get the data I have? I absolutely need to know that as the reader. Where did your data come from? Maybe they're a public use data set like SEER, or maybe it's patients from a single institution. And how did you get their data? Did they consent? Did the data come from an existing retrospective cohort of a data set you mined where consent wasn't needed? I need to understand this. It's the critical first part of your methodology. The second two pieces are your design and the study period. It matters greatly what years your data came from, depending on the research question. In my field, critical example, the prostate-specific antigen test came out in 1990. It was widely disseminated across the US in the early 90s. My cohort goes back to 1990, the patients, the 30,000 patients I oversee. Whenever I do a study, I'm always asked, but do you have data from the PSA era? Because everybody in the 90s wasn't using it, in the early 90s. So I have to be very mindful that this was a tool that got introduced that changed the field, and it came about in a moment in time. So how does time affect that finding? And I think time is always important when you're dealing with cohorts or data sets that span more than 5 years. And again, it depends on the research question. If your cohort only spans 1 year, but your question is an infectious disease question, well then 1 year will matter. So be mindful of why time might matter and tell the reader what your study period was. We're going to talk about the limitations and the types of study designs when I go over the epi and stats, so I don't want to get into it too much here, except to say that there's a hierarchy of design rigor. The least rigorous designs are case series and ecological studies. The most rigorous is a randomized clinical trial. But as we all know, you can't always conduct a clinical trial, not only because it's expensive, but sometimes it's not appropriate. Sometimes it wouldn't be ethical. If your research question was, I suspect that there's a carcinogen in the environment in this city and it's causing cancer, you can't study that question in a randomized clinical trial because you can't randomize people to something that you hypothesize is knowingly harmful. So if your question doesn't lend itself to a clinical trial, then it's okay that your rung of the ladder in your study design isn't at the most rigorous. That's okay. And it may be a question that is best suited for a design that's somewhere in the middle of that ladder. That's all right. You do need to talk about that, though, in the conclusions and in the discussion section as a limitation, potentially. So we'll talk about that a little bit more with the epi as well. Another mistake I see a lot of people make is forgetting to really clarify the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And one of the things I tell my team to do, even if it's not going to go in the paper, always have a flow diagram of how you started with your data set and everybody that came out at every step in the analysis. And a couple of times where the flow diagrams I received didn't make sense to me for my analysts, I would go back to their SAS code. And for those of you that don't know SAS, it's a statistical analysis software that we do all of our data modeling in. And I'll go back and I'll see that they didn't annotate a step. But it was an important step. It caused men to fall out of the analysis. And it's not in my flow diagram, and I don't know where those 10 men went. Even if it's one man, you have to have it clarified. Why did somebody fall out of the analysis as you carried out the steps of your work? Very important. And it's nice to have that diagram for you. It doesn't need to go in the paper, as I mentioned. It could be supplementary material if it needs to be. But most important, you need to understand. How did you go from the beginning to the final study sample? And then we get to measurement tools and techniques for study predictors. In my field, we have very specific measurement tools for some of the outcomes and predictors that we care about. In other fields like mental health, you have a battery of instruments. And different instruments might have different strengths and weaknesses since you're not all in mental health. I will talk maybe about urology or neurology. If you have instruments that measure cognitive ability, I'm sure there's probably a dozen things you could choose from. And some of the considerations you might need to weigh are what's going to be the patient burden of having to administer this instrument? How long is it going to take? Am I really going to have enough time with the patient to get the data I want? Or is there a validated instrument that's a shorter version of this instrument that might be equally as useful? So you have decisions to make before you begin collecting data on what measures you're going to use. So I would just suggest be very, very aware of the weaknesses and strengths of each of those instruments, because every one of them comes with something. It's the classic, and I had a professor at Berkeley that used to say this all the time, we measure everything imperfectly. Even if you're in a lab, don't kid yourself. We measure everything imperfectly. And so just be aware of what the imperfection is, the extent of it, and how you might actually be able to speak to it and say, well, we know we measured this imperfectly, so we used a second tool to make sure there was consistency across findings. Sort of in the spirit of a sensitivity analysis, if you know one tool is imperfect, use a second if you can, so that there's a consistency in data generated, and at the end of the paper you can say, while one tool is imperfect, as is another, the results were consistent regardless of which one I used. And then that lends a lot of strength to your findings, that you did your due diligence to think about where the data that you gathered might be flawed. Study covariates should also be specified in your methods. Everything that you measured, anything that ends up in your modeling or your data tables. So typically, as we know, a table 1 is sort of the descriptive table of the study sample that's been examined. And if you include 10 demographic variables and 5 clinical and 6 instruments that are psychological in nature, whatever you include in that table, it needs to be in your methods. How did you measure that? How did you categorize it? What was the instrument? Who's validated it? Citation for who published it? You need all of that in your methods section. And then, of course, you need to mention your primary study endpoints. This is probably the place I see people blend it in with the covariates. And so then as a reader, when I'm reviewing a paper, it doesn't stand out as a separate section, so that I'm reminded again. I saw it in your intro, what was your primary study aim, but now I'm seeing it again in the methods. Oh, that's right, this is their dependent outcome. This is the outcome that they're predicting. So then I'm set again in my mind what I'm going to see in the results, what I'm going to see in the tables. I'm reminded. And redundancy is a critical tool in writing. There are times to use it and times not to. When you want to make sure the reader is clear on the question of what's your predictor and what's your outcome, redundancy is good. And then I mentioned that some reviews, some papers require actually that you mention that you have IRB approval, that they won't accept your paper if you forget to mention this. And somebody might be nice about it in your review and say, please just revise this. I've had papers get rejected because we didn't mention it, which seems crazy, but it was a requirement of the journal, and as the author, it's my job to meet all the requirements. So if I fail to meet one and someone's in a bad mood, they are absolutely at liberty to say you failed to meet the requirements of my journal and we're not considering your work. So just don't lose an opportunity to be reviewed for something silly like that. That would be a real shame. And then finally, the last section of the methods is typically your statistical analysis section. And if you don't have a statistician that you're working with, if you're doing your own stats, I strongly encourage you to at least have a statistician, a friend, somebody who knows somebody to look at this section, because this is usually the most poorly written section when I deal with my residents and even with my postdocs. It's usually written in such a way that it meanders between the descriptive to the more formal multivariable, back to more descriptive univariable, unadjusted methods, back to this, that. It needs to flow. The way you present your tables and figures should mirror the way the stats are explained. So if you start with a table 1 that's a descriptive table, and then you move to an unadjusted table, and then a multivariable table, and then a figure, and then another figure, write your statistics in that order so that the statistics mirror what the reader's going to see in your figures and tables at the back of the paper. Before I go to the next slide, I know this is a lot to take in. Does anyone have any questions about the methods? Because to me, that's the most important section. Please.
I don't have any questions about the slides, but the line is on and it's let me try. I don't want to interrupt.
Oh, please. Okay, I'm so sorry. I'm only looking down here and I can't see up there, so I apologize. It's just too light, too bright. Okay, please, thank you for, and I should have said this at the beginning. Feel free to interrupt me, because I can talk a lot and I've had a lot of coffee, but please raise your hand and interrupt me. I encourage it strongly. Yes?
You just mentioned that if someone finds a SNP and this SNP is not reported before with some diseases, so it's not, we can say it's novel. So what we should report?
Well, that would be novel, right? If it's never been associated with a disease before, then that is. What I'm saying is be careful. What I'm saying is think before you say that, because I see it all too often, especially in the cancer field, where we have SNPs that are associated with African-American men getting prostate cancer. And I'll sometimes see a variant of a very well-documented SNP being referred to as novel. But it's just a variant on something that's been published in probably 1,000 papers. So just be careful. And it's okay to use that, but the reason it would offend me as the reviewer is if you use it in your title, and then you say it in your conclusions, and then you put it into the tables, and you put it into the results, and you keep repeating it over and over as though you've discovered, you know, the end of the earth. And I know that it's a well-discovered variant of something that's been around for years. So the example you provide is novel. Just be careful. Does that help? Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay. All right, so the results section. This is another place where I think people need a lot of guidance and hand-holding, because it's tempting once you have your results and you've put them into tables and figures, it's tempting to report everything, to just have this like brain dump of every finding in the results. Often, well, not often, always, papers have limitations on the word count. Just like the abstract does, so does the overall paper. This is a section where you can be very tight and focused and strategic in what you say so you don't waste your word count here. I have the ability as the reader to consult your tables and figures. I don't need you to point me to every finding, even if it was statistically significant. What I'm looking for as I approach your results, now that I've read your primary aim, and I've read your methods and I like them, and I come to your results, I'm ready to get excited. What did they find? Did they prove their hypothesis? Are these good data? Is this something exciting I'm going to learn? Once I get to that point, I'm excited you've got my attention. So if you start peppering me with a million means and statistics that don't matter and don't help me understand the bigger story of your data, I'm going to start falling asleep and I'm going to be really disinterested. And now you've lost a chance to engage me and move me on to the next part of the paper, which is the discussion. So this section should be very tight. You should not have a wasted word here. And again, it's always good to have, this is something I always do now. I would never write a paper without doing this. I decide from all the tables and figures that have been generated from my statisticians, I sit down with them, we talk about them, I make sure that I have every stat I need, and then I choose. I decide. If I know the journal only allows 5 tables and figures combined, and that's kind of a common metric, I decide what am I going to include. And I go through and I X out everything I don't care about, or I circle from a table the single statistic I care about, and that becomes a sentence instead of a table. And you can always offer supplementary tables, but the ones you include, you need to decide on them. And you need to be very clear and not change your mind. It needs to be decided up front. And then the results are a piece of cake to write. It becomes very easy as you go through them, not only the sequence and order of how you're going to present the results, but what really jumps off the page. What does the reader need to know? I would never have a results section that was more than 4 paragraphs. I don't think I write papers now that ever have a results section longer than that. Now again, I want to be careful because some of you are in fields where that may not be appropriate, where you may have 10 experiments that all go into one paper. And I work with basic scientists. We do a lot of translational research in my program, and some of the journals they submit to traditionally do want longer results section. So you, the author, you, the first author, has to know what are the requirements and expectations of the journal to which I'm submitting. It sounds incredibly obvious. I feel like I'm stating the obvious, but I am amazed at how often I don't see people do that, that's not the first thing they do. And it should be. You need to know, where am I sending my paper and what do they want to see? So again, telling the best story. And then secondary goals is organizing things. I will often boldface Table 1, Figure 1, Table 2, Table 3, Table 4, Figure 2. I want the reader to know how to weave through my results and quickly find the place they need to go to turn to the back of my paper and find the proper data that's being referenced in that paragraph. Don't make the reader work hard. Again, if another flaw I've seen, and I work with senior physicians that are in the military who get very annoyed when they read things and it's not obviously and clear right up front. They'll lose their patience, and then you've annoyed them, and now you have an annoyed reviewer. You don't want an annoyed reviewer. I think that's obvious too, but it's really important because they'll come at you with harsher critiques. They'll have worse comments to make about you. I see this all the time. So just be careful to make it structured in a way that's user-friendly to the reader. Everything is about that reviewer and what they're going to be thinking when they read your paper. The discussion section I find to be the hardest part of the paper to write. Hands down, it's the challenge because not only are you very briefly restating the top level maybe findings of your paper, but you're also weaving it into the greater body of literature that's been already published and how you stand out as different, and in an indirect way, how you stand out as better. And what follows the first paragraph of the discussion, that weaving between your data and the larger body of literature, is typically the limitations of your study. You want to be honest. And I encourage people, without being overly critical of your work, what's reasonable? If something's a limitation, but every person doing your work suffers that same limitation, don't beat yourself up for it. It's okay to acknowledge it, but don't beat yourself up. You're in a landscape where everyone's dealing with the same limitation. It's okay. The worst thing you can do is not mention one that's important, as though you're going to hide it from somebody. Trust me, you won't. Somebody will think of it. Someone always thinks of it. And it really looks bad. It looks dishonest. And then again, now you haven't annoyed me as the reviewer, but you've lost my trust. Now I'm thinking, this person either doesn't understand their work and the limitations in their field, which now I'm not thinking much of the person as a scientist, or they're trying to disguise or sweep under the rug an important limitation, which makes me not think much of the person's integrity. So it's okay to have limitations, we all do. And we don't have to be exhaustive in listing them. I would stick with no more than 3 to 4, unless your paper's full of them, in which case maybe you need to be rethinking the study and not publishing it yet. But that's very important, is to bring up the limitations. And then you want to get into the strengths. I like putting the strengths second because I want to leave my reader with the positives. Some journals now don't allow this. In fact, I'm putting something in this week to JAMA Oncology, something I'm very excited about, and we love our data, but the journal's requirement is the second to last paragraph is the limitations. And then you end on conclusions, and it can't be more than 100 words, which is basically a few sentences. So the reader is necessarily ending on the limits of your paper. And I hate it, but it's where I want to get published, and this is the journal requirement. So again, everyone has to suffer through this that's publishing there. I'm not unique. But it's important to know how to highlight your strengths, especially the most important ones. So in my database, the 3 things that we always have going for us that almost no one does is that 1 in 3 men in my 30,000 patient cohort self-reports as African American. That gives me one of the largest cohorts in this nation, worldwide, of African American men with prostate cancer. And that's a disease that affects 1 in 5 men nationally. So it's a very important cancer, and it's a very important cohort. I love bragging about that. It's one of the first things I always say, and I don't care if I repeat myself in every paper, I always want people to know that about my database. The other thing I brag about is we've been around for 25 years. So the median follow-up on my patients is over 10 years. And that's a nice long follow-up. Very few people have that because most programs don't last this long. We exist in perpetuity, we get new money every year, so we have the luxury of existing. So we've built an infrastructure that I like to brag about. Here at NIH, you've got infrastructure. So if you have a data set that came from here, you get to brag about that. It's unique to this institution, it's unique to your institute within the NIH. Be okay to brag about that. And then another thing I like to brag about is that we have over 100 clinical variables we collect on almost every single man. So I know a lot about each man. I know every type of treatment he got, every single procedure he underwent, because the DoD, the Department of Defense, was one of the first organizations in the world to start an electronic medical record. So even a man in Germany who's one of my guys, one of my patients, when he pops up in a clinic somewhere abroad, I see him in my EMR. So we have an EMR dating back to the late 90s. DoD was just one of the first to do it for whatever reason. I don't know the full history of it, but it's a wonderful thing. So I have these rich clinically annotated data. I've got a lot of African American men based on self-report, and I've got long-term follow-up. So I'm always bragging about those 3 things. So find some things to brag about in your data. I'm sure they're there. Okay. So the conclusion section is typically very brief. It's usually no more than 1 paragraph. And again, per the journal guidelines that you need to follow, you need to reiterate the main takeaway. The number 1 thing that should leave the reader excited, they've already read your whole paper by this point, they've looked at the tables and the figures if they were reading the results carefully, and they have a sense of what story you've told, but retell the best part of that story in 1 sentence. Don't forget to do that. Very often people just kind of repeat themselves in the conclusions, and I feel like it's such a missed opportunity. Make me excited again, because that's the last paragraph I'm reading. And now I'm about to go fill out your review online. I'm about to log in and say, okay, I've decided. It's a revise and resubmit major, it's a revise and resubmit minor, or it's a reject. I've made my decision up. Leave me with the best piece of your story in the conclusions. And what's the broader generalizability? In my studies, I often get to say that even though we're military, because the cohort is so large and it's racially diverse and the longitudinal time trends are there, we are generalizable to men in the US. If I had a small cohort from just one of my centers that was only maybe 5 or 10 years old and I said that, oh my gosh, I would be hugely criticized, because how dare I generalize to the whole US population of men with a small cohort, not racially diverse, short time frame. I don't get to do that. So just be careful, but generalize. Let us know, who do these findings potentially, what are the implications for others of these findings? How broadly can you generalize these findings? And again, be careful. Don't overstate. It would almost be worse to overstate than to be modest and say, it's possible or it's plausible that our findings are generalizable to XYZ people. Modesty is good in the conclusion. Finally, tables and graphs, as I've mentioned, journals will have a limit. Some allow some supplementary information. So as you choose what tables and figures will be your final, just know that some of the journals will allow overflow material so that you don't have to cut out data that you think are critically important, but there's just not enough room to put everything in there. The references to me, oh please, yes.
Would you recommend that like overflowing data that's going into the conclusion be a very general like piece of data that's more, it's like applicable to kind of the whole message? Or is it just kind of like extra?
It's a great question. I'm thinking as you're asking that, when have I used it? When have I pointed? It's typically a finding that's not a central theme of the paper, but I'm so worried that somebody's going to say, aha, she forgot to do that I just want it there. In fact, I can think of one right now because we just decided not to include it as supplementary, but this week we were talking about it. One of the critical predictors in my study that I'm sending to JAMA Onc does predict my outcome, and it does so with gusto, and I'm so excited and I can't wait to submit this paper. But all of a sudden I had this light bulb moment like, oh no, I only modeled it categorically. And I did it in quartiles, which is a very unbiased way to cut your data. But what if somebody says you picked those groupings because it favored your finding? What about if you treated it 5 other ways? What if you did quintiles? What if you did it continuously? What if you dumped that outlier? You know, all these other scenarios popped up in my head. So my poor statistician, I know she hates me this week, I said to her, run it every way. Don't send me tables. Don't bother to waste your time redoing figures and tables, but send me the SAS output and we'll go over it together and we'll just say consistent, consistent, consistent. And that's what we got to do. And so then I decided, well, do I want to put the data in? Do I want to just say we did it and hope they believe me? Or do I want to actually put some findings in there so that they see an odds ratio and a p-value? And so I'm not just saying I did it, I'm actually saying here was the effect estimate. When you treat this continuously, the odds ratio is 2. When you put it in quintiles, it goes down to 1.5 or whatever the case may be. P equals 0.0001. So I wanted them to see that. I decided that was the best way to do it. The data estimates are in the results, and then I don't need to put that in as a supplementary table. They could ask. It's possible they're going to come back to me and say, we want the whole table. But at least I gave data. At least I took the time to think about it, the weakness of categorizing a continuously expressed variable. So that's one good instance. Flow diagrams are another. If you don't want to waste a figure on how you identified your study cohort, I often see flow diagrams get pushed to supplementary. Where I see it with the basic scientists is almost always with extra experiments, where they wanted to rule out a problem. So they did some sideline experiment that's completely not the big story, but it's an important sub point to make. So those are all good uses of sup, tables and figures. Does that help? Okay. Anybody else? Questions? Okay. So references, can I ask for a show of hands, how many of you use EndNote or some form of a bibliographic database? Can't get that out. Okay, good. I'm sad that it's not all hands, and I would just say to anyone whose hand didn't go up, please use one. They're just magical. You think Google's magical? These are magical. I'm not kidding. Like, they really are so easy to use. And the most beautiful thing, so I have one of my analysts who's like a rock star of finding references. I don't know how she does it. I really don't. It's this black box that I'm not touching. But she'll go in and she'll find a paper that nobody can find, and then she saves me the PDF clip. So when I go into my EndNote library, which is a software like any other software, you launch it on your machine, I see the full citation and I see the PDF clip. So anytime I want to go back to that paper and pull it up to read it, I don't have to print it. I hate printing paper. There's no paper allowed in my office anymore. I hate paper. But I want to be able to pull it up again. And so now I have it in this database. And the other beautiful thing about EndNote is it becomes unwieldy after a certain point because you get so many references. I think we're at like 6,000 right now. And I don't want to sift through that. I might not remember the first author's name. So even though I can organize it by last name of first author, what if I've forgotten that? What I can also do is create sub-libraries. And you can create as many as you want. It doesn't matter, there's no limit. And what I'll typically do is every time I'm writing a new paper, I'll create a little sub-library with the name of that paper so that I can always come back to it. And then if I do get a revise and resubmit and I have to redo the paper, and let's say language needs to get moved around and paragraph 1 becomes paragraph 5 and 4 becomes 3 and 2 becomes 6, if I have to rejigger all the language, EndNote, in the click of a button, re-references all the proper places. It remembers the placeholder and which papers, 1 to 50 to 500 to 1,000, was associated with the end of that sentence. And it reformats my reference at the back of the paper. It's magic. Please use it. And I use EndNote. I'm not a salesperson for EndNote, I promise. I'm not getting paid by EndNote. There's other softwares like Ref Manager. I hate Ref Manager. I didn't say that. It's awful. It's a terrible system. But whatever works for you, just use one. Make sure, because when you go, another great feature, you go into PubMed and you want to pull a citation, rather than having to type it all up and possibly make typos and complicated last names. That is a key feature. You can actually save the file and import it into EndNote. In a couple of clicks, the entire citation populates. And then I forever have it. So if you're not using one, please, please do. And then some journals will have a limit. I actually had a journal get upset with a submission because we only had 20, and they said the average is 30. So go find 10 more papers to cite. And it was kind of a new topic where there really weren't 10 more papers to cite. So I had to write to the editor and say, I'd be really stretching it to do that. How about we settle it like, let's compromise here, maybe 22, 23, and they were okay with that, but the typical length of their references was 30. So I say these things because sometimes these weird pieces of feedback will come to you, and you're thinking to yourself, is this really a reason I'm gonna get rejected? Like, come on. And it might be, and it's gonna be so stupid, and it's gonna upset you. You gotta shake it off, get back on the horse, and move on, and maybe never go to that journal again until they change that policy. But there are weird rules, so again, read the submission guidelines because it should all be spelled out in there. And if it's not, they can't reject you on that basis. That wouldn't be fair. And then finally, some final sections of the paper might include acknowledgments. Don't ever forget to acknowledge somebody that helped you, that hasn't warranted co-authorship, but really did something for you. And I don't mean like every person under the sun that you work with. I mean, maybe they helped give you access to important articles that you wouldn't have had otherwise, or they were the ones that analyzed a part of the data but not all of it, so you can't list them as the senior statistician. Don't forget to acknowledge people. It's a politeness that's appropriate and the right thing to do. And then finally, I always have disclaimers and disclosures. Again, I mentioned this before, don't forget to put those in. Conflicts of interest are sometimes required, and funding sources. Any paper that's associated with the federal grants I have as PI, I have to put those on. It has to be acknowledged that that work was done because of the funding I have from NIH and DoD. Don't forget to mention that. And maybe you're not the fundee, maybe it's your mentor who's the PI on the grant. Get their grant number from them or their assistant, make sure it's on there. And then finally, this topic. So I mentioned earlier that this can create a lot of hard feelings and sensitivity. I've had this happen more than once. It is now my habit, the minute a discussion begins around a research topic and a paper, that we start talking about this. Who's going to lead? Who's going to be the first author? There are 3 coveted positions on any paper. First, second, last. Those are the positions you want to be in. You're not going to be last unless you're running the lab that the work is done under, you're the PI on the grant that funded the work, or you're really the most senior person in your field of all those on the paper. That's appropriate for senior. The trickier ones I find to be first and second. After that, it kind of doesn't matter. No one's really paying attention, and if you're looking for tenure or promotions, you don't get to brag about being third author. Like, no one's asking you that. They're going to be asking you about first and second. There are some journals that actually now allow for co-first authorship. I don't have a full list of those, but that's something to explore if you're considering applying, sending your work to a journal, and you and another person feel that you have equal ownership over the work and the writing. If you want that opportunity, seek out a journal that offers that, because they do exist. Probably one of the most sensitive situations I ever ran into, and this could happen if you're not in a position for very long, if you're only somewhere for a year. As I mentioned with the beginning of this session, that diagram that I said will take about a year to complete all the steps from idea to publication. If somebody's in an environment and they started the work and they were an integral part of it, but then they leave and the work changes fundamentally, maybe the entire question changes, and it's grossly rewritten and the findings are different than what you thought they'd be, you're rewriting massively, you don't get to be first author anymore. You just don't. And I've grappled with this because I have given it away anyway, because I didn't make that clear, and I felt, it's not fair. This person thought this and I never made it clear. That's my fault. So don't make that mistake, because then the person that is doing the hard work, uploading the submission, addressing the revise and resubmit, sending the letter to the editor, following up as corresponding author, all that hard work, second author, really, like that's just not right. And so if this is clarified up front, not just that you're the author, I don't mean just say who are the first, second, and third. I mean say who they are and then tell them what they need to do. What is it that's expected of you? If you're not seeing this through to the very end, you don't get to keep this position on the paper. And that may sound harsh. I don't think it is. After all the years I've been doing this, I do feel there's a fairness. And I know as a writer myself, I would never let somebody put me as first author unless I did all the heavy lifting. Unless I was really the one who did most of the writing, most of the revisions, uploaded, saw it through to the very, very bitter end. I wouldn't allow someone to put me. I would feel wrong. So don't feel guilty about this. But as you're starting out, and you know, earlier I asked you guys to raise your hands if you were either a first author already or you're working on a paper where you're a first author. Now's the time to have that discussion. If you haven't already had it, like leave here today, go right to your email and say, we need a meeting because we need to clarify the roles and expectations. And if somebody expects to be first author or even second, and they don't expect to have to do the hard work, I'm sorry, that's too bad. That's my tough love stance on that. Like, you don't get to be a first author if you're not really going to do the hard work. And this, again, often happens when someone leaves a position because they've moved on to the next great thing, or the residents I work with because they're only with me 6 months. And so I now have that conversation with them, especially more than anyone, and they're very nice about it. Very often they don't even care, but if I promise that to them, I don't get to take it back if I haven't clarified it. So I'm beating this topic to death. I just don't want you guys to make that mistake. I see it all the time. And even with people that I feel like they should know better, this mistake happens. So just be mindful of it. And then finally, approvals. These are just some of the types of approvals you might need before you send a paper out. Get familiar with this process. I guarantee no matter where you are here at NIH, there's an office where somebody's in charge of this, where they can help you and say, okay, you're about to send a paper out. Here's what you need to do. You need to give me 2 weeks to review it and vet it and make sure that if there's an NIH disclaimer that needs to be on here, it's in the proper place, you've used the proper language. Things that can disappoint people sometimes are how long these approvals will take. At Walter Reed, where we send a lot of our papers, it sometimes takes a month, and everyone wants to scream and get mad at the messenger. I'm like, I'm sorry, we have to do it. There's just no choice. So plan ahead for that. If you know you have a draft that's 90% done, the PAO office isn't going to care if you change it by 10%. Make sure, ask them that, and then give them a final draft, but get the routing process going, because it can be long with government agencies like you're in and like I'm in. Okay, before we start Module 2, I feel like I've done a lot of talking, and I want you guys to feel like you can ask questions and stop me and not just be talked at. Is there anything about the elements, any concerns you have, especially about the authorship? Yes?
Actually, about the hard work or the heavy work. Because, for example, in your case, you have a database.
Right.
What happens if I approach you and say, okay, I want to see some cognitive changes in how it relates to the PSA.
Right.
But I get the idea, I know the connections of what the research idea is. But if you do the analysis,
Right.
and I do the writing, who will be the first author in your mind?
It's such a great question. So it's a perfect anecdote that I go through all the time. So that's a discussion we have. So if you approach me with an idea that's your own idea, I'm now seeing this as your project. I now see you as the first author. But with the case of my cohort, I'm not allowed to give out raw data. It's absolutely protocol prohibited. So I do have to do the analysis in-house. My team does, I review it, we write the story together. As long as you take the leadership over telling the story and you take the time to understand the data and we're meeting and we're discussing, because it's a back and forth process. as long as you're doing that, I see you as the first author. And maybe I would put somebody on my team as second and I would be last, or I might be second. If somebody else, one of my two bosses are directors of the overall program, maybe it's something that comes from their shop, it's something related to other work they're doing, they might be senior and I might be second. But as long as you're really doing the writing, then I see that as yours. You've come to me with an idea that's fresh and new, that I wasn't already working on. What will sometimes happen to me is somebody will come to me with an idea that already overlaps tremendously with something else going on, and I don't want to turn them away. I don't want to say, no, 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 sorry, we're already doing that. So I'll try to think of a spin or a twist. If there's enough of one to warrant a separate study and a separate paper, then I can carve out something that's just for you. But I will tell you that this is actually a great example because I know there's a lot of public use data sets here at NIH and for my program as well. I've had people approach me at national meetings like ASCO and AACR and AUA, the big meetings I go to, and they'll come up to my poster and say, yeah, we want your data. And I will say, well, that's not allowed. We're happy to work with people. We're not required to. So be nice, because I'm thinking, I already don't want to work with you. You've already approached me with a lot of attitude and aggressiveness, and I'm thinking, you're not going to be fun to work with. Like, I have plenty of people to work with. Like, be nice. Because that's not, public use data, they're not obligated to you. My data aren't even public use. So if I have somebody approach me, I get to decide, as the head of the cohort, I get to decide who to work with. And you might go to the CDC or to NCI and their public use data, it might not matter who's the keeper. Like, you may have access just by putting in an application. I know some of these institutions are doing this now, but be aware of that. Understand what the access points are. And if they're not public use and there is a go-to like me or someone you need to come through, approach that person with some respect and make sure that you're asking to be invited to work with them. I'd like to work with you. I'd like to have access to this cohort so I can ask this great question, what do you think? I say yes to that all the time. And I get approached, actually we get approached by industry and pharma quite a bit. In fact, one of the feathers in our cap in the last 5 years was the validation of a very important tool, I can't say what it is, to look at prognosticating poor outcome in prostate cancer patients. And this tool does a beautiful job at it, but they needed access to cohorts like ours where there were biospecimens and clinical data and outcomes data. And the pharmaceutical company came to us and they wanted access, and we had to put together a legal agreement and IRB protocols and a lot of paperwork to finally work together. And then we all shared that and celebrated that together when the paper came out. So there's a lot of ways of working with existing cohorts, but do your homework about the access points. Do you know what I mean by that? Who's in charge of those data points? And again, I sound like I'm being awful. I would never say no to somebody, but if I'm approached in this aggressive manner, like I owe you my data, I don't care for that. And I even had, it's a funded grant now, so I can't be sour grapes about it. I had a colleague at my institution come to me and say, well, we're going to put in a grant and it's going to examine your cohort and it's going to be $1 million grant and we'll give you 10%. And I'm thinking, no, you'll give me 50. And I sound like I'm being kind of a jerk, but you have to be reasonable. If you have no data and you're coming to the data person, you're kind of not calling the shots. And so if you want to be a first author and you're coming to the person with the data, just be nice, be collegial, have a good idea, explain that you want to be first author. Definitely say that up front. I'd love to lead this. I want to lead the paper and be the first author. How can I do that with you? And I guarantee people will say yes. So,
Did you win? Did you get 50%?
60. But it was so rude. I'm thinking, you have no data. And so these things amaze me that they happen. And I think maybe sometimes when I don't know.
Sorry, it was right.
What's that?
That was a man.
Oh, I'm dying to answer that. I'll say no more.